Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 333 Book Club. I'm your host, Penelope Hartley, and I'm sorry I'm running a little bit late tonight, but we're just doing a really short, because I don't think anybody's joining me on the live today, but we're going to do a really short book club discussion of the book that I've written called Datura's Requiem. And let's see here. Sorry. I am looking for the right. Here we go. Yes, so my name is Penelope Hartley and I'm hosting. I wanted to create a book club that wouldn't shy away from diving into works that maybe were not so that were more difficult in terms of subject matter and in terms of like perhaps the writer uses some very interesting techniques, some interesting combinations of genres, just not straightforward mainstream, if you will, style literature. I wanted to wanted to attract other readers who are interested in works of art that kind of transcended the mainstream and that told amazing stories and had one of the things that I have noticed with a lot of writers who really reach beyond kind of a base skill level. There's a real love for language and a real love for the craft within that. And I think that sometimes that mastery or that playfulness kind of transcends readership sometimes. But it can also have the capacity to make reading a very engaging experience. So for a lot of different reasons, I wanted to try to create a book club that would explore those kind of things. So topics that maybe weren't because, for example, Datura's Requiem is very much about trauma and about destiny and about not really wanting to show up for your destiny because you have trauma, which I think that is a fair point. I think that I'm obviously writing from personal experience somewhat with this idea, but I think that a lot of people today have come to recognize that one of the things that you realize on a spiritual path is that you're very often you're the person holding you back. So I wanted to dive into a work of literature that kind of tackled that without, but also I wanted to make it a work of fiction, a work of literature. I wanted to employ different tools and different styles and different techniques to create this story. So you will find within Datura's Requiem a lot of different things that may at first be somewhat jarring. So the first thing, if you look at the cover, it's got my name on it, and it's got the name of the book on it, and it has a picture of a moonflower, which is another name for Datura, sacred Datura, and underneath that is the phrase of tragedy. So you know right away that this has something to do with beautiful and terrible things. I split up the prologue and the chapter separate from everything else because the story doesn't really start properly until chapter 2. And each one of the parts are broken down into years. So this book properly starts in 1978 and ends in 1991. And each of the 6 years, they're broken down into 6 parts. Then you'll see at the bottom, in place of a tragedy is a hope. So there's a lot of expectations that I'm building up in the first. This is, I think that often very good tragedies do have an element of hope in them, but I don't think that very often tragedies and hope coincide with each other. I think that one is often the other, but I don't think that one usually allows for the other one. Things are traumatic or they're hopeful, and I think that something that we're finding out as a society is there's very often we have this kind of society is very fluid, and it can be our lives can be a lot of things at once. I became attracted to the ideas of dichotomies when I was very young in high school. And dichotomies are words that are opposite in nature. They're very paradoxical. So, like bittersweet, for example, has a dichotomous meaning, the bitter with the sweetness. So I think that life is very often not one or the other, but both. So this is a tragedy and a hope. And so the first kind of strange thing is the subtitle that changes once you get to the chapter page. And the second thing is the chapters themselves are broken into parts by years. So this starts in 78, ends in 91. And then the next thing that you come across is the prologue, which is a poem attributed to Ophelia. So this is the only poem within the book that I wrote for this book in particular. The other poems came from when I was studying poetry in grad school. But this one is the only exclusive to Datura's Requiem poem that I've written. You don't know anything. You don't know who Ophelia is. You don't know why there's a poem just stuck in at the beginning. So I'm going to read it. And it's called Pages of My Life. I tore the pages of my journal apart until all the words were meaningless, then taped them back together. That's when my life sort of became one long poem. What is poetry but bright-hearted words longing for a different sound? My life was one forgetting, cut and pasted between the pages of nightmares. Nightmares like the shadowmancer with his haunting black eyes. What does he want? I scream at him. The words clatter into the night. No answer. He leers at me with unblinking eyes. Does the blonde man really have wings? If he wraps his arms around me, we can fly away together. Please, God, send the angel. I can't stay. Nothing turns the darkness away. So I wait. So I write poems and wonder if the new meanings will work like spells cast into the sun. Or has the shadow of death grown too heavy and long? My heart may never take flight. Who knows? Maybe God's taking rewrites. So we have this poem at the very beginning that speaks of very dark things, nightmares, and something called the shadowmancer in the shadows. And there is something very harrowing about taking words and making them meaningless. I think that act in itself is a very I think that when things start to become meaningless, they've either been overused and we've been inundated with like the word love, for example. What does love mean? You say it often enough in enough different ways that it starts to become blurred. The meaning starts to become blurred. I don't think that's what Ophelia is talking about here. I think that when words become meaningless, it's an act of, it's a sign that depression has started to render life a bit gray. And I think that's what she's trying to tap into there when she says that the words have become meaningless. But she does try to save herself. because she tapes the words together and makes new poems and new riddles out of them. And she writes poems, and she says she waits, and she wonders if the new meanings will work like spells cast into the sun. Well, and of course, the sun is the life giver, the thing which is responsible for all life on Earth. So there's that. Let's see here. Did some. So one of the questions that I have for readers of Datura's Requiem is, there's something summoning about pages of my life, like a fragmented, disparate, half spell, half suicide note. What do you make of Ophelia's opening? Are we watching her memory distort, or is she literally rewriting reality? And the second part of this book, you have, if you're looking at my edition, which is the print edition, you have 1990. So you know that a new part has started, and it goes into chapter 1, which is Sebastian's first chapter. And it starts out with a quote from Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1. To be or not to be, that is the question. So if you know anything about Hamlet, you know that he's asking whether or not he should be alive. And I use quotes from Hamlet throughout the book for each beginning of the chapter. And they don't always correlate with parts of the play. They might have a different meaning within the work itself that I have ascribed them to. So it might reference something in the chapter rather than being significant to the play. So you can't always, some of it's decorative, but this one isn't. This one is definitely Sebastian wondering whether or not to be or not to be. And this beginning is called an in medias res beginning. And it's starting in the middle of the book. And it's short, so I guess I can read it right quick. Sebastian Winter, 1990. I glanced to my right. The pines and aspens beside the road were a furious brown patchwork blurred into a mess of dying color. They had the outline of the mountains rising to meet heaven in the breaking light. The tires screeched. Was I racing to meet heaven? Was she? A scream tore through me, the anguish ripping itself out of my throat as I gripped the wheel. All the violence I'd seen, everything I'd done, clawed at my insides. The Chevy skidded around a hairpin curve, the screech of rubber barely keeping me from smashing into the wall of rock towering on my right. I jerked the wheel, straightening it out as I barreled down the empty highway. On my left, just beyond the flimsy steel barrier, a 40-foot drop into the Valley of Shadows waited for me. I knew I should slow down. I glanced in the rearview mirror. My hair was matted with sweat against my forehead, mixing with the tears streaming down my face. My flesh was raw and bleeding from where I'd clawed at my eyes, but it didn't do any good. Another vision flashed before me. I saw her through him, through the contagion. His hands were still wrapped around her throat. She was breathing again. I could feel her soft skin pressed beneath my palm, the frantic pulse of her terror beating against me. I could hear the hitch of her breath as she struggled, powerless. Her tender neck, her racing heartbeat. Could nothing end this tragedy? I slammed my foot on the accelerator, feeling the engine roar. The tears wouldn't stop. My face burned, my mind reeling with every twisted, fractured memory of what the contagion had done. The images were as vivid as my own. I felt like I had a hand in all of it, and it corrupted my soul. The speedometer hit 80. The pulse pounded in my ears. The sun cast its first spears of light over the mountaintops. I batted at the tears, vision blurry, desperate for a clear thought. But the truth, the fucking truth, a stone lodged in my throat. I was no hero. I hadn't saved Ophelia. I looked in the mirror at my own reflection. My bloodshot eyes stared back at me. I never asked for this, but maybe I'd always wanted death. Fuck it. It jerked the wheel, threw the truck against the guardrail. Metal screamed against metal. The rail gave way. The Chevy spilled over the edge, falling through the first rays of sunlight streaming below. I began to fly. But before the end, there's always the beginning. And we go back to 1978. By chapter 1, Sebastian's already tearing down the highway, trying to outrun a nightmare that lives in his head. The way his memories bleed together, the contagion's grip on his mind, it's vivid, disorienting, and damn near possession. So, do you think Sebastian is really seeing through the contagion's eyes? Or is this just trauma twisting into his perception? These questions and more coming in later chapters. The play's The Thing. Sebastian, summer 1978. Chapter 2. The first time I saw Ophelia was the summer of 1978. She was 11 years old. I was already in makeup and wearing my costume, a stunning piece of over-the-top 1970s Western wear dyed black for my role. It was my second film. This one was called Blood Moon in Silver Canyon, and the budget was bigger, but the chaos was the same. Impatiently, I waited for the production staff and cast to recover from their hangovers and crawl out of their trailers so we could start filming. For reasons that are Capricorn and various, I was grumpy that morning, bored, impatient to get on with filming the damn movie. I spread across the arms of my chair, legs dangling over one side as I leaned over the other, my eyes rolling skyward, the script limp in my lap, voguing at God, if she cared to glance in my direction. As I lay across my chair, seething at the waste of time, of movement, like dark fabric caught in a cold wind, flickered to the right. I looked over to see a dark shadow slither across the bar doors that led into the set saloon, and heard the phantom tinkling of glasses, and then a laugh. It wasn't warm or friendly, that sound. The laugh was like the creak of a closing casket. It set my nerves on edge. I turned as another movement across the set caught my attention. Standing in front of the plastic saguaro cactus was a little girl. I squinted at her. She was not ominous, was not the source of that brittle laughter. Skipping. She looked for all the world like those two young girls who had hitched a ride hundreds of miles from Kansas or Oklahoma to find happiness in Hollywood, the land of dreams and broken stars. She waved at me. She started laughing, this little girl with the terrible fringe. Laughing at me? Why? It made me uncomfortable. A too familiar wave of anger burned under my skin. I rolled my head back, shut my eyes, and shouted into the void, "Cameron, what on earth is this child doing here?" But when I looked back, the girl had vanished. I rose, abandoning the script in my chair, and walked over to where I had seen her. Had I been so high the night before that I thought a saguaro cactus was a little girl waving at me? In the sand, there was no step in nor out. Only two small imprints of her sneakers remained. If the cactus knew anything, it kept its secrets. The air around where she had stood was heavy, like it was carrying a darkness familiar to me. I didn't know it then, but the contagion had already found her. Oh, so that is the first part of chapter 1. And so a lot of this book is set up to make you really wonder at the beginning. And I think it's important when you start reading Datura's Requiem to keep not only what you think is going on flexible, but also to at least make some assertions about what you think is going on. Because there's a lot of... I have a certain way that I interpret this book, and obviously how I wanted it to come across, but I think that that there's a lot of fluctuation in how real people think things that other people imagine to be imaginary or metaphorical are. So is is he hallucinating, or is he just, still high from the night before? Valid question. Even later on and earlier at the beginning of the story, he sees himself. He sees his this entity called the Contagion, which you meet in a couple of chapters, doing these terrible things to Ophelia, the girl who wrote the poem at the beginning. And she's a young woman by that point. But I think it's very important to consider whether or not, as it relates to yourself, because this is a book about healing from trauma and about understanding your own trauma. And I think that one of the things that's very important when if you decide to take that sort of a journey, or if you decide even to read a book about that sort of thing, is that fiction is the lie that tells the truth. And I think that we very often do that to ourselves. We lie to ourselves about things that we want to be true. For example, we project our own shortcomings onto other people, and we hate those shortcomings in other people, but that's just kind of a sign that we hate our shortcomings ourselves. And I just finished watching The Substance, which, if you haven't seen it, it's very much body horror flick, but it's also about hating yourself and your relationship with yourself, and not being able to escape yourself as well. So I think that a lot of times people do pin our own shortcomings onto other people and accuse them of being a particular way without any self-realization that we are doing. It's the pot calling the kettle black. So I think that once you dive into a book like Datura's that is about that sort of thing, it's good to kind of keep to understand like how your own shortcomings, not how you're perceiving the character's shortcomings, because very often that says something about ourselves. So anyway, there's nobody here, and I've been on for about half an hour, and I was planning on going until about 10, or going for about half an hour anyway. So that's that. I'm going to, I think for next week, if you check back next Thursday at 9 p.m. Central, I wanted to go through chapters 1 and 2 for next time. So let's read part 3, 1985, for next time. So we'll get through the end of the 70s and into the 80s. So if you could read, if you wanted to participate in next week's, read through to chapter 10. And as always, this is free for everybody to download. As long as you have something to download, you can have something to download it onto. You can download it. I'll double check and make sure it's in the description. All right, everybody, have a fantastic evening, and we'll see you next week for the 333 Book Club. I'm Penelope Hartley, and ta!